Okay, if you guys could go back to your historical context and draw a line under where we had Impressionism, because now we're moving on to the next phase in this time period of the 19th century, and we're going to talk about Post-Impressionism. And as you can tell, that includes artists like Vincent van Gogh. So Post-Impressionism will, as its predecessor, will focus on capturing kind of modern life and nature, but instead of choosing to emphasize abstract qualities or symbolic content of their work, they're going to try to explore new scientific theories and use distortion of form and color and try to express emotion. This period is definitely less unified. It's less directed and it's not necessarily restricted to geography. It seems like Impressionism is pretty much restricted to Paris or at least France, whereas this one is going to extend as far as Tahiti, which we'll talk about when we get to Paul Gauguin. They acknowledged that the artists did not have this unified approach, but they used Impressionism as a springboard for developing their own individual styles. Post-Impressionists are going to reject Impressionism's interest in capturing the essence of modern life and nature and instead choose to emphasize abstract qualities or symbolic content of their work. One important thing that they have to do is they're going to experiment with form and color. The abstracted color theory is going to be very important for the post-impressionists. A man named Chevreul, Shevrel, formulated the law of simultaneous contrast colors in 1820s and said that adjacent colors cast reflection of their own colors onto neighboring colors and also creates the effect of their complementary color. So the example for this means that when blue is next to yellow, the eye will detect a trace of purple in the blue, which is the complement of yellow, and with the yellow it'll show a trace of orange, which is the complement of blue. So post-impressionist makes this break with past styles in iconography and often contains an abstracted color scheme and complex symbolism. Post-impressionists like Gauguin will read a piece as, I'm sorry, I messed up on that. Their symbolism only often made sense to them. It needed to be explained to other people in order to get it. So similar to the idea um, of having to have knowledge of what the artist intends. So that could be considered esoteric. Gauguin's reading only piece is a good example of this. So when we get to the Gauguin piece, you guys can see that. They want to express a deeper meaning, not just optical sight, and they often want the viewer to feel the work of art rather than just merely understand it, and they use color to do this. So one good example of that with color is that oftentimes they would use certain colors to express anger, anxiety, or passion, and that often is used with the color red. If you're looking for calm or coolness or restfulness, growth, that could be green. So, this idea of using simplified colors and definitive forms are going to have like a big impact on the artists that succeed the Impressionists. The French post-impressionists reinterpreted art as an expression of an interior world of imagination or imposed new scientific rigor on representations on the world around them. And these post-impressionists are going to be highly influential to later movements, the next set of isms that we get to. With Van Gogh, he's most famous for using the technique called impasto, which is using a paint knife, like a palette knife, and applying the pigment directly to the canvas. And it was usually very, very thick and stood off of the page. So when I talked to you guys about Starry Night, I had some close-ups of when I was in New York and saw it, and you could really see the paint off of the canvas. And that's very different than Renaissance that were even trying to hide their brushstrokes, and that is not what Van Gogh's interested in. Seurat uses the dot method, which is basically pointillism. Pointillism means a series of dots. And if you guys have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and the print is in my classroom too, it's supposed to be like a day at the park. I'm not sure the French pronunciation right now since it's not in front of me, but it's basically where he just uses dots of pure color but mixes it with all these different colors, and then our eye corrects it from afar to actually look like it's like the one color, not a series of different colors. And then Paul Gauguin is going to really look at what we call, well, what they would have called primitivism. He's looking for like a pure society. There was a lot of talk during this time period about the fact that people were looking for utopias. And so Paul Gauguin's actually going to go to Tahiti, and he's going to paint what they would have considered primitive people. And he'll get a lot of fame for that later on. And then we have Paul Cézanne, who is going to reject perspective altogether and will be kind of one of the early artists that will look at for abstract expressionism. Okay, so let's move on to Van Gogh's Starry Night. Starry Night is number 120, and he was from the Netherlands, so he was Dutch. He didn't start painting until he was older. Before that, he worked as an art dealer. He was a teacher. His parents were very religious, and so he was an evangelist for a little while. His dad had been a Protestant minister before, and then in 1880 is when he decided to become an artist. He moved to Paris in 1886, where he encountered the French avant-garde, and Van Gogh is going to kind of search for a way to create personal expression of his art. At first, he does adapt Seurat's pointillism by applying brilliantly colored paint in a multi-directional strokes of impasto or thick paint to give his pieces really a lot of powerful emotional energy with that palpable surface texture. He also was very influenced by the Japanese prints, which may explain some of his color choices and compositional choices. He did have a lot of psychological issues. Many believe he suffered from epilepsy. And so some think that the images of his art are often inspired by people with epilepsy sometimes experience at the beginning of a seizure sort of this haze of in their eyesight. And so a lot of times many people have argued that he's trying to capture that haze of an oncoming seizure. And he didn't make any money for any of his art during this time period. He's one of our artists that did not sell one piece of art during his lifetime. So he was dependent on his younger brother Theo, and then when he did have money, he would spend it on alcohol rather than food, and absinthe, which is a liquid that is known for being hallucinogenic, and it also affects the optical lobe in your brain, which controls vision. And so his paintings were often efforts to communicate his emotional state, which could be part of his psychological issues, or it could be part of the fact that he was using hallucinogenic drinks while he was basically self-medicating for what was wrong with him. Let's see. He did paint for only 10 years, but his paintings that he produced will contribute to what will later emerge as Expressionism because the intensity of his art would override any desire for fidelity to any actual appearance of things. His early images and pictures of Dutch peasant life depicted rugged brushstrokes and dark earthly tones. He also did a lot of images of the working class, people or places. He did a lot of self portraits because it was the cheapest way to have a subject matter would be to have a self portrait. There's a few things that happened in his life that were very uh, that we know about that had totally uh, affected him, and that happened. You know, we all know about his the fact that he cut his ear or mutilated his ear in 1889. This is what we're seeing here is a bandaged painting self portrait that he painted shortly after he left the hospital. And the reason why that happened was because he was probably self-mutilating after he had a fight with Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh were roommates in Arles, which is a small town in France, and Paul Gauguin basically announced that he was going to go to Tahiti to paint, and that upset um, Van Gogh because I'm sure there were a lot of reasons why it upset him, but he is going to um, end up in a what we would call an insane asylum. And that's when he is going to be known for painting Starry Night. During his lifetime, actually, he sold one piece, but most were traded for payment or given away. Another thing that affected his mental state was the fact that he was born 1 year after his brother. He had an older brother who was born on the same day, 1 year apart. And that was something that when he was going to school every day, he would pass by his brother's grave. And his brother, older brother, was given the name Vincent van Gogh as well. And so imagine walking to school every day and seeing your name on a headstone. So it didn't really start off well for him in regards to his mental state. Um, let's see. Today we have two of his works are considered among the 10 most expensive ever sold. One of them would be Starry Night, and which is what we have here. This isn't my favorite work from Vincent van Gogh, although it is the most popular or most famous of his collection. But it is painted in 1889. It's about 2 feet by 3 feet. And it was painted while he was in the mental asylum, where he lived basically on and off due to psychological crises that often would last from days to weeks. When he was in a state of psychosis, he could hear loud noises in his head, and that often he might have suffered from migraines as well. And so that meant he usually would hurt himself, like again, self mutilation, and wouldn't paint. He tried to commit suicide and eventually achieved that in 1890 with a gun. The gun was never found, and he was found by a bunch of kids who might have taken the gun, but he was found in a wheat field, which he often painted. Anyway, with this piece, the depiction of night was according to Van Gogh's perspective, and it helps explain his interest in cypress trees. Cypress trees were often used in France and Italy to mark graves, so there's like a symbol of death in here. There's stars and the moon have a glow around them, which could be that haze, that aura that people see often when they have a seizure. There is a bright star on here, which is considered the planet Venus, which is often associated with love. But to Van Gogh, death, he didn't see it as an end, but what they call a metamorphosis. His brushwork is extremely expressive and intense. It's clearly a record more of what he felt than what he saw. It's almost black in the background. The tree dominates the foreground. There's a night sky that overwhelms this little town that actually looks very Netherlandish. And there's also the church steeple in the kind of in the center lower part of the painting that is definitely to be noted. So this is one of his most famous pieces, and it is a brilliant work by Vincent van Gogh.